The morning Clarence Conroy rode into Caldera Flats, New Mexico territory. The dust rose up around his horse's hooves like something warning him to turn back, and he should have listened. It was the summer of 1882, and the Santa Fe Railroad had been creeping across the territory like a slow iron snake, buying up land, pressuring ranchers, and sending men like Clarence ahead to do the polite work before the lawyers arrived with their cold language and colder numbers. He was a land appraiser, employed by the Southwestern Land and Development Company out of Santa Fe, and he had appraised 47 parcels of land in the last 2 years without losing a single night's sleep over any of them. He was good at his job precisely because he did not allow himself to feel anything about it. Land was land. Numbers were numbers. He rode in, he measured, he calculated, he rode out, and somewhere behind him a family packed their wagon or accepted a check they could not refuse. He told himself it was honest work. He told himself someone else would do it if he did not. He told himself a great many things in the long, quiet hours on the road between towns. Caldera Flats was a town of maybe 400 souls clinging to the edge of a wide basin that opened into Red Mesa country to the south and west. There was a general store, a livery stable, a saloon called the Copper Bell, a small church with a crooked steeple, and a post office that also served as the town marshal's office when Marshal Hector Ruiz wasn't busy with something else. The town had the particular quality of a place that had survived hard years and was not sure whether the years ahead would be any kinder. Clarence tied his roan gelding, sergeant, to the post outside the Copper Bell and went inside to get a whiskey and ask after the Pritchard place. He was not a man who drew attention easily. He was 32 years old, lean without being thin, with dark brown hair that was slightly too long for a proper businessman and gray eyes that gave him the look of someone who was always calculating something, which he usually was. He wore a good coat and a decent hat, and he carried a leather satchel that contained his survey instruments, his ledger books, and a small brass compass that had belonged to his father. The barkeep, a heavy-set man named Otis Drummond, set a glass in front of him and gave him the long look that all barkeeps in small towns give to strangers. Passing through, Otis asked. "Business," Clarence said. "I'm looking for the Pritchard land, the widow Pritchard." "Can you point me in the right direction?" Something shifted in Otis's expression. It was subtle, the kind of thing you noticed only if you were paying attention, and Clarence was always paying attention. "Delia Pritchard," Otis said, and the name came out with a weight to it like he was setting something heavy on the bar between them. "Her place is about 4 miles south on the main road, then east when you see the old cottonwood split by lightning. You'll see the house from the rise." "Thank you," Clarence said. "She know you're coming. My company sent notice." Otis wiped the bar with a cloth that didn't look like it had been washed recently. "She got the notice," he said. "She's not happy about it." Clarence drank his whiskey. "They rarely are," he said. He rode south in the afternoon heat, and the land out here was the kind of land that made a man feel small and aware of it in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. The basin opened wide to the south, and the mesas were the color of dried blood in the angled light, and the sky was the specific shade of blue that only existed at altitude in the desert, a blue so deep and pure it almost hurt to look at directly. There were long-grassed flats and dry washes, and the occasional stand of cottonwood shimmering silver in the heat, and every now and then a hawk riding the updraft so high it was barely a speck against all that blue. He found the split cottonwood and turned east, and from the rise he could see the Pritchard place laid out below him like something from a painting. The house was adobe with a wooden second-floor addition that someone had added later, painted white, and now weathered to a soft gray. There were outbuildings, a barn that was in good repair, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, and a large corral where several horses stood in the shade of a rough-cut wooden awning. Beyond the house, the land spread south for what he estimated to be 250 acres, maybe 300, rolling gently toward the mesa rim where the railroad wanted to cut its grade. There was a kitchen garden behind the house. There were fruit trees, apple and peach, arranged in rows that someone had planted with intention and tended with care over many years. There was a windmill turning slowly in the dry afternoon breeze, and there was a woman in the front yard splitting wood. Clarence pulled Sargent up on the rise and watched for a moment, not out of any improper intention, but because the scene stopped him in a way he hadn't expected. She was wearing a plain blue work dress with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and she had a good rhythm with the axe, setting each piece of wood with efficiency and bringing the axe down clean. Her dark hair was pulled back but had come loose in the heat, and she had pushed it back from her face with one wrist without stopping her work. She was, he could see even from this distance, not a woman who did anything by halves. He rode down the rise. She heard him coming and stopped splitting wood, but did not put the axe down. She stood with it in one hand, held low, and watched him approach with the particular stillness of a person who has learned to measure a stranger before deciding anything about them. He pulled up a reasonable distance from her and touched the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Pritchard," he said. "Miss," she said. "I go by Miss Pritchard. My husband has been gone 3 years and I've been running this place alone, so I don't see much point in using a title that refers to someone who isn't here." He noted the correction. "Miss Pritchard, I'm Clarence Conroy with the Southwestern Land and Development Company. I believe you received I received your letter," she said. The axe didn't move. "I also used that letter to line the bottom of the dog's water dish, so you can judge my opinion of it from that." He wasn't sure whether to smile. He decided against it. "I understand you're unhappy about this process." "Do you?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "The company has legal authority to assess any land within the proposed corridor. I'm not here to pressure you. I'm here to appraise the land and submit a value to my employer. And then your employer uses that value to make me an offer I'm supposed to be too poor and too alone to refuse," she said. She had brown eyes, he could see now, and they were direct in a way that made it difficult to look somewhere else. She was 28 or 29, he estimated. She had a face that was pleasant in repose and striking when she was angry, which she currently was. "I know how this works, Mr. Conroy. This is not the first time the railroad has sent someone out here. I've been told this is my first visit on behalf of the company," he said carefully. "That's true. The last man they sent was named Patterson, and I chased him off this property with a loaded rifle before he got the gate open." She tilted her head slightly. "I've had time to calm down since then, so you can open the gate, but understand that my calming down does not mean I've changed my position." He considered this. He dismounted, because sitting on horseback while she stood holding an axe felt like the wrong posture for this conversation, and tied Sargent to the fence post. He opened the gate, closed it behind him, and walked toward her with his satchel over his shoulder and his hat in his hands, which was a gesture of respect that he had found smoothed things over in situations like this. "I appreciate you letting me approach," he said. "I give you my word I won't behave like Patterson." "I don't know enough about you to know what your word is worth yet," she said. "But you can start by telling me honestly what the company intends to do with my land if they acquire it." "Grade the rail line through the southern portion and build a water stop and provisioning station," he said. "It would be a significant operation. They'd need approximately 80 to 100 acres along the mesa rim." She looked at him steadily. "And the rest of my land, the 230 acres that the railroad doesn't even need." He said nothing, because they both knew the answer. Once the railroad carved through a property, the remainder often became functionally unusable for ranching. The noise, the smoke, the traffic of workers and transients, the disruption of water sources. The company knew this. They priced the whole parcel accordingly and waited for the landowner to accept. "That's what I thought," she said. She looked at him a moment longer, then turned and set the last unsplit log on the block and split it with one clean stroke. She picked up both halves and stacked them with the others, and then she set the axe against the woodpile and looked back at him. "You may as well come inside and have some water. You look like you've been riding since before noon." He had been riding since before sunrise, in fact, but he didn't say so. He followed her inside. The interior of the house was practical and lived in, and showed the evidence of a life built and maintained with care. There were good rugs on the floor, slightly worn. There was a bookshelf along one wall with more books than he usually saw in a ranch house, everything from agricultural manuals to a set of Shakespeare that had seen significant use. There were curtains in the windows made from a fabric that had been carefully chosen for its cheerful color, now faded to something softer and more complex. On the mantel above the small fireplace, there was a photograph of a man who must have been her husband, square-jawed and serious in the way that all photograph subjects were serious in those days. And next to it, a small painted portrait of an older woman who shared enough of Delia's features to be her mother. There was also a child's drawing pinned to the wall near the kitchen doorway, a horse rendered in large, enthusiastic strokes of charcoal, and Clarence looked at it and then at Delia. "My nephew visits in the summers," she said, reading his expression. "My brother's boy, he's 7. She poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup and handed it to him. "Sit if you want." He sat at the kitchen table, which was solid pine scrubbed clean. She did not sit. She stood at the kitchen window looking out at the yard with the expression of someone standing guard. "Tell me something, Mr. Conroy," she said. "Does it bother you, what you do?" The question caught him off guard, which almost nothing ever did. "It's a job," he said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at the water in his cup. "It bothers me sometimes," he said, and was surprised to hear himself say it because it was more honest than he usually allowed himself to be with clients. Particularly when the land is something that someone has built something real on, something that took years. She turned from the window and looked at him with an expression that was still guarded but had shifted slightly, the way a door shifts when someone turns the latch without quite pushing it open yet. "My husband and I broke this ground 8 years ago," she said. "Thomas was a difficult man in some ways, but he knew land, and he knew water, and we built this place from nothing. I dug that kitchen garden myself. I planted every one of those apple trees. I know where the water runs under this ground in August when everything else is dry, and I know which pastures go brown first and which ones hold green the longest, and I know that what looks like worthless scrub to a railroad company is actually some of the best natural grazing in the territory." "I believe you," he said. "Then write that in your report," she said. "Write that this land is worth more than the railroad thinks it is, and that taking it from the woman who built it is not a simple transaction. Write that in your numbers." "My numbers reflect market value," he said, "not personal value. Maybe someone should change that," she said quietly, and turned back to the window. He left that evening without opening his satchel. He had not measured a single acre, had not paced out a single boundary, had not written a single number in his ledger. He told himself it was because the light was failing, and there was no point beginning a survey he couldn't finish, and he would start fresh in the morning. He told himself it had nothing to do with the woman standing at the kitchen window, or the sound of her voice saying, "Maybe someone should change that," or the kitchen garden she had dug with her own hands, or the apple trees she had named, and he found out later that she had named every one of them, which should have been eccentric and instead seemed to him like the most sensible thing a person could do in a hard country. He got a room at the only boarding house in Caldera Flats, run by a widow named Mrs. Estella Vargas, who made excellent green chili and asked no questions, which he appreciated. He ate his supper, sat on the narrow porch in the cooling night air, and listened to the coyotes working the flats to the south, and thought about the Pritchard place in a way that was already different from how he had thought about the other 47 parcels. He rode back out the next morning with every intention of beginning the survey. She was already in the south pasture when he arrived, moving a herd of about 40 head of mixed cattle with the help of a large black and white dog named Bishop, and a bay mare that she rode with the ease of someone who had been on horseback since childhood. She had not seen him come through the gate yet, and he stood at the fence for a moment watching her work the cattle, calling to Bishop with short, precise commands, and using the mare's body to cut and turn animals in a way that spoke of long practice and natural ability. The morning was cool, and the grass in the south pasture was green even in July, which confirmed what she had said about the water, and the light came low and gold over the eastern mesa and turned everything it touched into something worth looking at. She noticed him when she turned the mare on a cut, and she pulled up and looked at him across the pasture with her hat brim low against the morning sun. He lifted his hand. She turned the mare and walked her over to the fence, and Bishop came behind her, a serious, medium-sized dog of no particular breed but significant intelligence. The dog sat down at the mare's feet and regarded Clarence with professional assessment. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," he replied. "People say a lot of things," she said. "I've learned not to organize my expectations around what people say they'll do." "That's practical," he said. "Living out here makes you practical," she said. "Or it kills you. Those are generally your two options." She looked at his satchel. "So today you measure." "I need to do my job," he said. "I'm sorry for that." Something in her expression softened very slightly, as though she appreciated the apology even while knowing it changed nothing. "I won't stop you," she said. "I won't make it easy either. I'm going to be right beside you the entire time, telling you what you're looking at, and you're going to listen." "I expected nothing less," he said. So they spent the day walking the land together, which was not at all the way land appraisals usually went. Usually the owner was either absent or stood at a sullen distance, while Clarence worked his way methodically across the property. Delia Pritchard did neither. She walked beside him, or slightly ahead, and she talked about the land with the specificity and passion of someone explaining a beloved and complicated friend. She showed him the spring-fed draw on the southwestern corner that ran even in August when the creek a mile east ran dry, and the natural windbreak of pinon and juniper along the northern boundary that protected the cattle from the winter northers, and the clay pan she had discovered in the third year that had told her exactly where to dig the well, and had proven her right when the well came in at 22 feet, instead of the 65 the well digger had predicted. She showed him where the ground was rocky and thin and nearly useless, and she showed him where it was deep and rich and dark as chocolate, and she showed him the old Apache trail that cut diagonally across the southeast corner, a path that predated anything the settlers had done here, worn down an inch or two into the earth by generations of feet and hooves. "Do you know anything about the Apache history out here?" he asked her, pausing at the trail. "Some," she said. She crouched and touched the edge of the worn path with one hand. "An old man named Santana used to camp along the draw when I first came out here. He was Mescalero Apache, had been on this land his whole life. He taught me where the spring was. He taught me about the clay pan." She paused. "The army moved his band to the reservation at Bosque Redondo 2 years ago. He didn't want to go. I imagine he didn't want to go very much." She stood up and looked at Clarence steadily. "This land remembers people who were here before me too. That's something the railroad company probably doesn't put in their reports either." He said nothing to that, because there was nothing to say that would be adequate. They ate lunch in the shade of the split cottonwood at the east boundary, and she had brought cornbread and dried venison and a jar of cold water from the spring, and they sat on the ground with their backs against the tree and ate without much talking for a while, which was comfortable in a way that surprised him. He was not generally a comfortable person to be around, or so he had been told. He had a tendency toward precision that people sometimes found cold, and a directness that people sometimes found blunt, and a self-containment that people sometimes found standoffish. He had spent much of his adult life in a state of functional solitude that he had decided was simply his nature and probably for the best. Sitting under the cottonwood with Delia Pritchard and the dry wind moving through the silver leaves, eating cornbread and listening to Bishop panting in the shade a few feet away, he felt something he had not felt in a long time, which was the desire for the moment not to end. "You don't talk much," she said, "for a man whose job involves talking to people." "Talking isn't usually productive in my line of work," he said. "Listening is." She gave him a look that was halfway between skeptical and amused. "Then you must be a strange kind of appraiser." "I've been told I'm a strange kind of everything," he said. She laughed then, unexpectedly, a real laugh that broke through her guardedness and showed him something of the person underneath the practical, defended exterior. It was a good laugh, warm and unguarded, and it changed the whole tenor of the afternoon. "What brought you to this kind of work?" she asked. "My father was a surveyor," he said. "I grew up with maps and measuring equipment. It seemed like a natural progression." He paused. "I thought I'd be working for the government, doing actual survey work, charting territories, filling in the blank places on maps. That was what I wanted." "What happened?" "A man named Everett Storch offered me twice the government wage to work for his company instead. He picked a piece of bark off the cottonwood trunk. I was 23 and the money seemed important. And now I'm 32 and the money still comes in, but the thing I wanted at 23 seems further away than it did when I started." He looked at her. "That's more honest than I usually am with clients." "You keep saying that," she said, "that you're being more honest than usual." "What does that mean?" "I don't know yet," he said, and meant it. They went back to work in the afternoon, and he did measure because he was nothing if not thorough, but he measured everything, not just the railroad corridor. He measured the spring. He measured the depth of the topsoil in the dark areas. He measured the height of the windbreak. He drew the Apache Trail into his sketch of the property boundaries. He wrote down everything she told him, all the things that would never appear in a standard appraisal report, the names she had given the apple trees, the spring that ran in August, the clay pan that had told her where to dig. He did not, on that second day, add up any of the numbers. He told himself he was still gathering information. On the third morning, he arrived to find that the situation had become more complicated. There was a man's horse tied at the fence, a buckskin with a fine saddle that spoke of money, and when he came to the door, Delia answered it with her jaw set in the particular way he was coming to recognize as her expression when she was controlling her temper. "Mr. Conroy," she said, and stepped aside so he could see into the front room, where a tall man in a good suit was standing with his hat in his hands, looking around the room with the proprietary air of someone who has already decided what he's going to do with a space and is merely confirming the details. "This is Mr. Gerald Ashby. He represents a separate buyer who is apparently also interested in acquiring my land." Gerald Ashby turned and extended his hand to Clarence with the smooth ease of a man who spent a great deal of time extending his hand to other men in ways that established hierarchy. He was about 40, well-fed and well-dressed, with pale eyes and the kind of handshake that pressed just a bit harder than it needed to. "Conroy," Ashby said, "I've heard of you. Good man. Good solid work." He said this in the tone of someone complimenting a useful tool. "I didn't realize the railroad had already sent someone out. I suppose we're going to be stepping on each other's toes." "That happens sometimes," Clarence said neutrally. "I represent Ashby Cattle and Land," the man said, which answered the question of whether his name was also his company, which it was. "We're looking at a consolidation of properties in this basin. Several ranches, some homestead claims. Miss Pritchard's land would be a significant addition. What would you do with it?" Delia asked, and her voice had the particular quality of someone asking a question they already know the answer to but want to hear said out loud. "Graze it," Ashby said. "Run cattle. It's good grazed land, and with the spring you've got in the southwest corner, we could—" "How do you know about the spring?" Delia said. A brief pause. "Word gets around," Ashby said smoothly. Clarence watched this and said nothing, but he was listening very carefully, and what he heard in the space between Ashby's words and Delia's questions was something that made him uneasy. "I'm not interested in selling to Ashby Cattle and Land any more than I'm interested in selling to the railroad," Delia said. "My position is the same to both of you. This land is not for sale." "Miss Pritchard," Ashby said, with the careful patience of a man accustomed to overcoming female objections by outlasting them, "I want you to understand that my offer would be generous. You're a woman alone out here. 3 years a widow. Surely you've considered. What I've considered, she said, is my business, Mr. Ashby, and I'll thank you to remember that I am alone out here by choice, not by incapacity. She looked at him with those direct brown eyes. This isn't the first time someone has tried to tell me that being a woman alone is a reason to give up something I built. It is not a reason. It is, in fact, the thing that makes me less inclined to give it up. Ashby left shortly after, but the smoothness of his departure bothered Clarence in the way that frictionless things sometimes do when they should logically have met resistance. He said nothing about it as he and Delia walked the north pastures that morning, but something was working in the back of his mind like a stone in a boot. "How long has Ashby been interested in this land?" he asked as they stood at the northern fence looking out at the Pinon and Juniper windbreak. "About 6 months," she said. "He sends a man out every few weeks. Different men, mostly. They ride the boundaries, look at the water, count the cattle." She paused. "Last month one of them pulled up one of my fence posts along the south boundary, moved it about 3 feet onto my property. I moved it back." Clarence looked at her. "Did you report it to the marshal?" "I told Hector Ruiz," she said. "He said he'd look into it. He's a decent man, Hector, but he doesn't have much jurisdiction over what a cattle company does, and he knows it." She looked at the windbreak. "I'm not afraid of Ashby, but I'm tired of fighting on 3 fronts at once." "3 fronts," he said. "The railroad, Ashby, and the general difficulty of running a ranch alone." She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. "The hand I had, a man named Aurelio, left for the silver mines in April. I haven't been able to replace him. I'm managing the cattle myself with Bishop and the mayor." "That's a considerable amount of work for one person," he said. "It is," she agreed. "But it's my considerable amount of work, and I intend to keep it." She turned and looked at him, and there was something in her expression that was different from the careful guardedness of the first day, something that had been shifting incrementally over these past days as they walked the land together, as he asked questions and listened and wrote things down that no appraiser should write down. "Why haven't you sent your preliminary numbers back to the company yet?" she asked. "Because I'm still gathering information," he said, which was the same thing he had been telling himself. "You've been gathering information for 3 days," she said. "You know every inch of this property. You've measured it twice in some places." She studied him. "What are you doing, Clarence?" It was the first time she had used his given name, and it dropped into the conversation with a weight that neither of them could pretend not to notice. He looked at the windbreak for a long moment. "I'm not sure," he said. She didn't press him on it, which he appreciated, and they walked back toward the house in the late morning heat with Bishop ranging ahead of them and the wind coming up warm and dry from the south. That afternoon, while she was in the kitchen making supper, and he was sitting at the kitchen table with his ledger open and his pencil in his hand, and not writing anything down, an older woman arrived at the door. This was Delia's neighbor, Mrs. Conception Medina, who owned the adjacent property to the east, and who turned out to be a compact, energetic woman in her mid-60s with silver-streaked black hair and an expression of permanent mild amusement at the world. "I heard the appraiser was still here," Conception said, setting a covered dish on Delia's kitchen table and sitting down across from Clarence without being invited, which he immediately liked about her. 3 days is a long time for an appraisal. "It's a complex property," Clarence said. Conception looked at Delia and then at Clarence and back at Delia with the precise expression of a woman who understands exactly what is happening before anyone else admits it. "Of course it is," she said. "Delia, this is tamales. You haven't been eating properly." "I eat fine," Delia said. "You eat what's quick," Conception said. "There's a difference." She poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove with the comfort of someone who had done it 100 times before. "Mr. Conroy, have you heard that Ashby has been making offers on 3 other properties in this basin? The Orozco place and the 2 Miller claims." "I hadn't heard that," Clarence said. "Orozco refused," Conception said. "But he's an old man and his sons are in Albuquerque. I think he may not be able to hold out much longer." She set her coffee cup down. If Ashby gets Orozco's land and the miller claims he has the north and east sides of the basin. If he then gets Delia's place, which is the best water in the whole basin, he has effective control of the grazing for 20 miles in every direction. Clarence thought about this. He thought about it with the part of his mind that was a surveyor's mind, that thought in terms of geography and control, and the way water and land and access intersected in ways that determined the shape of human lives in a hard country. That would also give him leverage over the railroad, he said slowly. If Ashby controls the water and the best approach grade to the mesa, the railroad would have to negotiate with him instead of acquiring the land directly. Both women looked at him. Which means, he continued, that the railroad's interest in this property and Ashby's interest in this property may not be coincidental. They may be working at cross purposes, or he stopped. Or someone told Ashby the railroad was coming, Delia said quietly, and he's trying to get in front of them so he can force a sale to the railroad on his own terms and keep the profit. That's speculation, Clarence said. Is it wrong? Delia asked. He thought about Gerald Ashby knowing about the spring. He thought about the smooth confidence of a man who never seemed surprised. I don't know, he said honestly. After Conception left that evening, taking the empty tamale dish and her sharp eyes with her, Delia and Clarence sat on the porch in the fading light and didn't talk for a while. The coyotes were calling in the basin and the first stars were appearing, and Bishop had put his head on Delia's boot and gone to sleep. My husband thought this land was worth fighting for, she said eventually. Thomas wasn't a perfect man. He was hard sometimes in the way that the land is hard, and there were years when things between us were more practical than warm. But he believed in this place. He died believing in it. She was quiet for a moment. He got thrown from a horse out on the south pasture. It was a dry October. I was in the house when it happened. By the time I found him, it was too late. She said this without breaking, but he could hear what it cost her to say it flatly like that, how much practice it had taken to be able to say it at all. I stayed because he was right about the land, and because leaving would have meant he was wrong, and I didn't want him to have been wrong about the thing he believed in most. Clarence did not say anything immediately, because nothing immediate was adequate. He sat in the quiet for a moment before he spoke. My father died when I was 20, he said. He had a small claim along the Rio Grande, not much, a few acres. He worked it for 15 years and never struck anything worth speaking of, but he loved that piece of land the way some men love their children. When he died, I sold it to settle his debts, and I have never in 12 years found a way to make peace with that. He looked at the darkening sky over the mesa. I think perhaps that's why I took this job. Some attempt at being near land that matters to people, even if my role in that proximity isn't, he stopped and looked at his hands, isn't good. She turned and looked at him in the last light, and there was something in her expression that was not pity and not sympathy exactly, but something more precise than either of those, the look of someone who has recognized something familiar in an unexpected place. You're not a bad man, she said. I'm not sure I'm a good one either, he said. Maybe that's the most honest thing anyone has said on this porch in years, she said. He rode back to town and he did not sleep well, and in the morning he sat at the small desk in his room at Mrs. Vargas's boarding house with his ledger in front of him and his pencil in his hand, and he thought about what he was going to do for a long time. What he was supposed to do was submit his preliminary appraisal numbers to the company office in Santa Fe by Friday. What the numbers would show, if he filled them in, was that the Pritchard property was worth about $14,000 on the open market, and that the railroad could likely acquire it through the offer and escalation process for somewhere between $11,000 and $13,000, which was enough money that a woman alone in the territory should theoretically be willing to accept it. What the numbers did not capture was the spring, the clay pan, the deep topsoil in the dark areas. The way the land sat at the head of the basin with the mesa rim to the south, positioned to control the water flow for miles in every direction. If he valued the land according to what it was actually worth to someone who understood water rights and grazing control in the territory, the number was closer to $25,000, possibly more. He closed the ledger. He had not written a single number down. He went to find Marshal Hector Ruiz instead. Hector Ruiz was a careful, thorough man of about 50, with a thick gray mustache and the calm, unhurried quality of someone who had been dealing with the difficulties of frontier law for long enough to know which things resolved themselves and which things required a push. He was Mexican-American, his family going back in this territory 4 generations, and he knew the land and the people in it with the intimacy of deep roots. "Ashby," Hector said, when Clarence laid out what he'd pieced together. They were sitting in the marshal's office, which smelled of coffee and old paper. "I've been watching Ashby for about 8 months. I know he's been pushing on the properties in the basin. I know about the fence post on Delia's south boundary. There may be a connection between Ashby's acquisition strategy and the railroad's corridor plans," Clarence said carefully. "Someone on the inside may have given Ashby information about the railroad's timetable." Hector looked at him steadily. "You think someone in your company is talking to Ashby?" "I think it's possible. And if it's true, and Ashby completes his acquisitions before the railroad formalizes its offers, the railroad will end up paying 2 or 3 times what they expected to pay, and the landowners in between will be squeezed out anyway. They just won't get the benefit of the higher price." Hector was quiet for a moment. "That's a complicated thing to prove," he said. "I know," Clarence said. "But if I submit my appraisal numbers to Santa Fe, and there's someone in the Santa Fe office passing information to Ashby, then Ashby will know the railroad's valuation of Delia's property within days. And he'll use that number to make her an offer that's just slightly above what the railroad is offering, with the apparent advantage that she gets to keep her land in private hands instead of selling to the railroad. Except Ashby will then sell to the railroad at a profit," Hector said. "Yes. And she ends up with less money than she should have gotten and her land in the hands of the railroad anyway," Hector said. "Yes." They looked at each other for a moment. "Don't submit the numbers yet," Hector said. "I wasn't going to," Clarence said. He rode back out to the Pritchard place that afternoon and found her in the apple orchard, moving from tree to tree with a pail of water from the spring, checking the soil around the roots. She had named the trees after women she admired. She had told him, and she moved through them with the comfortable ease of someone visiting old friends. The largest tree, a mature apple she called Margaret after her grandmother, had branches that spread wide and low and provided shade enough to stand under on a hot afternoon. Clarence stood under Margaret and watched her work for a moment, and then she looked up and saw him, and something shifted in her face that he was pretty sure was genuine gladness, which undid something in him that he hadn't known was tied tight. "Twice in one day," she said. "I need to tell you some things," he said. He told her all of it. Everything he had told Hector and everything he suspected and everything he knew for certain, and he told it plainly without softening or hedging, because she was a woman who deserved to have the full picture and make her own decisions. She listened without interrupting, which was a thing he had come to appreciate about her, the quality of her attention. When he was finished, she stood with her water pail and was quiet for a moment. "So you think someone at the company is feeding Ashby information," she said. "I think it's likely. And you think if you submit your numbers, Ashby will use them against me?" "Yes. And so you haven't submitted them?" "No." She set the water pail down and looked at him with an expression that was complicated and clear at the same time, the way certain kinds of weather are. "Clarence," she said slowly, "you're not doing your job." "No," he agreed. "Your company is going to notice that." "Yes." And then what? He had thought about this, sitting at the desk in Mrs. Vargas's spare room with his unwritten ledger in front of him. "I'm going to write a report that accurately reflects the value of this land," he said. "Not the value that's convenient for the company's acquisition strategy. The actual value, including the water rights, including the grazing control, including the strategic position at the head of the basin. If the company wants to acquire this property at a fair price, they'll have to offer that fair price. And if they don't want to pay fair value, they can find a different route for their railroad." She stared at him. "Can they fire you for that?" They can and they probably will, he said, and you're going to do it anyway. Yes. She was quiet for another long moment, and then she picked up her water pail and carried it to the next tree and watered it carefully, and then she stood up and looked at him, and there was something in her face that he had not seen there before, not the guardedness, not the anger, not even the occasional warmth she had let him see. It was something more fundamental than any of those things. It was trust. Why? She asked softly. Because it's the right thing, he said. Because the land is worth what it's worth, not what's convenient. Because, he stopped himself, because that was next in line was not one he was sure he was ready to say. She watched him stop himself, and a very small smile moved across her face. Because what? She asked. He looked at her, standing there under the apple trees she had planted and watered and named, in the yard of the house she had built and held and refused to surrender, in the afternoon light that turned the whole of the wide basin below into something golden and impossible, and he said, because I don't want to be the man who takes this from you. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, come have supper with me. It wasn't a declaration, it wasn't a confession, but it was an opening, and he recognized it for what it was, and he said yes. They ate at the kitchen table as the evening came on, and Conception had been right that Delia didn't cook much for herself, because it was plain food, beans and salt pork and good cornbread. But the simplicity of it felt like honesty, and he ate more than he had eaten at any meal in months. They talked about things that had nothing to do with land or railroads or appraisals. She told him about growing up in Kansas with 3 brothers and a father who farmed wheat, and believed that daughters deserved the same education as sons, which had given her the Shakespeare and the agricultural manuals in equal measure. He told her about growing up in Missouri with his father, the surveyor, spending summers in the field learning to read land the way some boys learned to read books. She told him about the first winter after Thomas died, when she had been so tired and so alone that she had gotten on the bay mare one morning in February with the idea of riding to town and not coming back, and had gotten halfway to the road before Bishop had come racing across the pasture after her, barking with such frantic urgency, as if he knew, and she had pulled up the mare and looked back at the house and the winter fields and the bare apple trees, and something in her had said, not yet, not yet, not yet. I'm glad you turned back, Clarence said. So am I, she said. Now she looked at him across the table. A few months ago I wasn't as sure. He understood what that cost her to say, and he received it carefully. What changed? He asked. She considered. The spring, she said. It was May, and the spring came back in the draw after running dry all winter, and I went down there in the morning and it was running again, this small clear water coming up through the rocks, and I thought, if the water can come back, maybe other things can too. She smiled, a little embarrassed by the sentiment. That sounds foolish. It doesn't, he said. You're being kind. I'm being honest, he said. You know the difference by now. She did know. That was the thing. After only a few days she could tell when he was being careful and when he was being honest, and she had found that he was careful rarely and honest often, which was the reverse of most people she'd encountered. After supper he helped her wash up, which surprised her, the easy naturalness of it, and then they sat on the porch again while the stars came out, and it was different from the previous evening. The previous evening there had been space between them, a respectful distance that acknowledged the strangeness and the uncertainty. This evening there was less space, and neither of them moved to create more of it. You should know that I haven't allowed myself to, she started, and then paused and tried again. It's been 3 years, and I've been careful not to let anyone, she stopped again. I know, he said. I'm not sure you do, she said. I'm not a woman who does things by halves. If I let something matter to me, it matters all the way. And I haven't let anything matter all the way in 3 years because I couldn't afford to be knocked down again, and I'm still not sure I can. She looked at him sideways. That's probably too much honesty for a 4th evening on the porch. You told me on the first day that you didn't know if my word was worth anything, he said. I've been trying to show you since then that it is. I'm still trying. He looked at the stars. I'm not a man who does things by halves either, and I haven't let anything matter in a long time because my work took me from place to place and nothing was ever. He stopped. You're the first person in longer than I can remember who has made me want to stay somewhere. She was very still next to him. I'm aware that I came here to do a job that works against your interests, he said. And I'm aware that what I'm saying changes the situation considerably, and I understand if you need time to think about all of that. I've been thinking about it since the second morning, she said, very quietly. He turned his head to look at her. She was looking at the sky with an expression that was open and slightly vulnerable, which he knew cost her something to let him see. Delia, he said. She turned and looked at him. He reached out and took her hand, which was work-roughened and warm and smaller than he had expected, and she let him hold it. And they sat like that in the dark with the stars enormous above them and the coyotes calling in the basin and Bishop asleep inside. And it was, he thought, one of the finest moments of his life, and he had done nothing to deserve it except show up and tell the truth. Things did not resolve quietly, because nothing in the territory resolved quietly in 1882. The following morning brought a letter from the Santa Fe office, delivered by the Thursday stage, demanding Clarence's preliminary report within 48 hours or face termination of his contract. He read it in Mrs. Vargas's kitchen, and folded it and put it in his coat pocket, and rode out to the Pritchard place with it still there. He also found, on arriving, that Ashby had been there before him. Not Ashby himself, but two of his men, large, quiet men on good horses who had apparently ridden to the gate, said nothing, and simply sat there for an hour before leaving. Delia had watched them from the window with a loaded rifle across her knees. They didn't come through the gate, she said, but they wanted me to see them. Intimidation, Clarence said. It's not working, she said, with the determined set of her jaw that he was coming to love, and then caught himself on that word and kept it very quiet inside himself for the moment. He went to see Hector Ruiz again that afternoon, and this time Hector had news. I sent a wire to the Federal Land Office in Albuquerque, Hector said, about the acquisition pattern and the potential inside connection at the railroad company. They're interested. He folded his hands on his desk. A federal agent is coming on Tuesday's stage. In the meantime, they asked me to request that any appraisals in the affected area be held pending review. Does the railroad company know about the federal interest? Not yet, Hector said. But Conroy, if there's someone in the Santa Fe office feeding information to Ashby, they're going to know soon. These things don't stay quiet. Clarence thought quickly. If I submit a falsified low appraisal to the company, Ashby's contact will pass it to him, and Ashby will assume his position is stronger than it is. He might overplay his hand. Hector raised an eyebrow. You'd falsify a company document. I'd submit a preliminary estimate that significantly undervalues the property, Clarence said carefully, which is, technically, a preliminary estimate. Preliminary numbers can be revised. Hector was quiet for a moment. That's a fine line. Yes, Clarence agreed, and if it backfires, then I lose my job either way and we haven't gained anything except the knowledge that it was worth trying. Hector looked at him steadily. You've got an interest in this beyond the professional, he said. It wasn't a question, but Clarence answered it anyway. Yes, he said, I do. Hector nodded slowly. Then do what you think is right, he said, and tell Delia to keep that rifle loaded. Clarence went back to Mrs. Vargas's and sat at the desk and wrote a preliminary appraisal report that valued the Pritchard property at $7,800, which was significantly below market value and far below what it was actually worth. And he submitted it via wire to the Santa Fe office that evening, and then he went and told Delia what he had done. She listened to all of it. She was standing at the kitchen stove making coffee, and she turned around when he finished and looked at him with a very serious expression. If this goes wrong, she said, you lose everything. Your job, your reputation, possibly more if it gets tangled up legally. I know, he said. And you're doing this for me. I'm doing it because it's right, he said. Those two things happen to coincide. She turned back to the coffee and was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Sit down, Clarence. There's something I need to say, and I need to not be looking at you when I say it." He sat down. "I've been very careful for 3 years not to want anything that I could lose," she said to the stove. "I've been very careful not to open any doors that I couldn't close again if I needed to. I've been managing this place and managing my grief and managing all the people who have tried to tell me what to do with my land and my life. And I have been very, very careful." She poured the coffee. "And then you came riding down from that rise with your leather satchel and your honest eyes, and in 4 days you have undone every careful thing I have done." She turned around and set the coffee in front of him and met his eyes. "I'm not sorry about that. I want you to know that. I am not sorry." He stood up, because sitting while she said that seemed wrong, and he stood up and looked at her across the kitchen table. "I'm 32 years old, and I have been extraordinarily careful about not feeling things since I was 20, he said. "And I am not sorry either." She came around the table, and he took her hands in both of his, and they stood in the kitchen in the evening with the coffee going cold, and Bishop watching them from the doorway with his serious border collie eyes. And she looked up at him, and he leaned down and kissed her, softly and carefully, the way you do something for the first time when you intend to do it for a very long time. The next 2 days were a peculiar kind of suspension. Clarence stayed close to the property during the day, helping with work that needed doing, repairing a section of fence on the south boundary that had been showing wear, helping shift the cattle to the west pasture where the grass was better, doing a dozen small practical things alongside Delia in the easy, comfortable way of two people whose bodies have decided they belong in proximity to each other, even if their minds are still catching up. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and talked the way people talk when they are simultaneously discovering each other and discovering things about themselves in the reflection of the other person. She read to him from the Shakespeare, not the tragic plays but the comedies which she preferred, and he told her about the blank spaces on the maps he had never gotten to fill in, the canyons and plateaus in the territory that had never been properly surveyed, and she listened with her head leaning against the porch post and her eyes on the stars, and said, "I'd like to see those places." And he said, "I'd like to show them to you." And neither of them felt the need to be cautious about any of that. On Sunday, Ashby came himself. He arrived in a buggy with one of his large men driving and the other riding alongside, and he came to the gate dressed in his good suit and his good hat, and this time Delia was standing on the porch and Clarence was standing in the yard by the fence, and Ashby looked from one to the other with a calculation that was not entirely concealed. "Miss Pritchard," Ashby said. "Mr. Conroy, convenient to find you both here." He was smooth, but something in him was slightly off balance, the way a man is when a situation has gone differently than he expected. "I heard from some associates that the railroad's appraisal on your property came in lower than expected," he said to Delia. "Naturally, I wanted to make sure you had options. My offer of 9,000 stands, and that's above whatever the railroad is planning to offer you." Delia looked at him with the steady eyes. "And where did you hear about the railroad's appraisal, Mr. Ashby?" A tiny pause. "These things get around," he said, the same words he'd used about the spring. "They seem to get around to you very quickly," she said. Ashby shifted slightly in the buggy seat. "My offer is generous, Miss Pritchard, more than the railroad. You'd be wise to consider it." "I'll consider it," she said, "in exactly the same way I've been considering all the other offers, which is not at all." She looked at him calmly. "You should also know that the Federal Land Office has been informed about the acquisition activity in this basin. An agent arrives Tuesday." The smoothness cracked, just slightly, just for a moment, but Clarence saw it and Delia saw it and they both knew it. Ashby recovered quickly and said, "I'm not sure what that has to do with my legitimate business interests." But his voice was a half-tone off from where it had been, and his large man on the horse had gone very still. "I imagine the agent will be able to sort all that out," Delia said pleasantly. "You're welcome to come back on Tuesday if you like. Marshal Ruiz will be here." Ashby left. The buggy turned on the road and went north toward town, and they watched it until it was dust in the distance. "Well," Delia said. "Well," Clarence agreed. "Do you think he'll try something before Tuesday?" she asked. "I think he might try something before Tuesday," Clarence said. "I think you should ask Conception if she'd be willing to come stay for the next 2 nights." Conception came that evening with 2 of her grown sons, sturdy men named Felipe and Jorge, who were perfectly pleasant and asked no unnecessary questions. And they slept in the barn and kept watch in the kind of informal, practical way that neighbors did things in the territory when someone needed looking out for. Clarence slept in the spare room at Delia's insistence, which he accepted only after she pointed out that Sargent needed to be at the Pritchard barn and not at the town livery if anything happened in the night. Nothing happened that night. But Monday morning, one of Ashby's men was found by Felipe at the eastern fence line, on foot, which was suspicious. And when Felipe approached him, the man claimed to be lost, which was a story that Felipe received with visible skepticism before suggesting that the man continue being lost in a northward direction. The federal agent arrived on Tuesday's stage as promised. A capable, spare woman named Agent Martha Wiles from the Territorial Land Office in Albuquerque, which surprised Ashby considerably when she introduced herself, because he had clearly expected the federal response to be a man he could manage. And Martha Wiles was not a woman anyone managed easily. She was 43, with close-cropped gray hair and reading spectacles that she wore pushed up on her forehead when she wasn't reading. And she had been investigating land fraud in the New Mexico territory for 11 years, and she had the look of someone who had seen every variation of this particular game. She met with Clarence and Hector at the marshal's office for 2 hours, and then she met with Delia separately, and then she sent a wire to Santa Fe that Clarence was not told the content of but which produced, within 24 hours, a sudden visit to Caldera Flats from a nervous-looking man named Darby, who was a junior manager at the Southwestern Land and Development Company, and who had, it emerged over the course of a very uncomfortable conversation in Hector's office, been passing information about the company's acquisition plans to a contact who turned out to be employed by Ashby Cattle and Land. Darby was not a bad man, exactly. He was a frightened man who had made a greedy decision and was now deeply regretting it. He cooperated with Martha Wiles in the comprehensive way of someone who has decided that cooperation is their best remaining option, and what he cooperated about was sufficient to confirm everything Clarence had suspected. The consequences were not immediate, because legal and official consequences in the territory in 1882 moved at the pace of bureaucratic processes and available manpower, which was slow. But they were set in motion, which was what mattered. Ashby's acquisition strategy in the basin was placed under formal review. His pending offers were frozen pending the investigation. The marshal had grounds to act on the fence post-incident, and several others that Conception and the Orozco family had documented. It would take time, but the mechanism of accountability was now engaged. Clarence submitted his revised appraisal of the Pritchard property the following morning, the real one, with all the actual numbers, the spring and the clay pan and the topsoil and the strategic position at the head of the basin. The number was $23,400. He submitted it with a report that explained exactly why the preliminary estimate had been submitted low, and exactly what he had suspected and what had been confirmed, and exactly what he thought the company should do about it, which was to either pay fair value or find a different route. He also submitted his resignation, effective upon receipt. He rode out to the Pritchard place with a lighter sensation in his chest than he had felt in years, and he found Delia in the kitchen garden pulling weeds in the morning sun, and she looked up when she heard Sargent, and she shielded her eyes with one hand, and the morning light was behind her, and she was, he thought, the most complete and beautiful thing he had seen in all his years of traveling across the territory, more beautiful than any mesa or canyon or blank place on any map. "Your face looks different," she said as he dismounted. "I resigned from the company," he said. She stood up from the garden row, soil on her hands, hair loose, Bishop at her feet. "Clarence," she said. "I filed the real appraisal," he said. "The whole thing, everything. They'll either pay you fair value or they'll take another route. Either way, the numbers are true." He held her gaze. "I know this leaves me without a job. I know the timing is." She crossed the garden in about 4 steps and put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him with a warmth and directness that was perfectly, entirely her. And he put his hands at her waist and kissed her back. And the garden was warm and green around them, and Bishop wagged his tail 3 times and then went to investigate something more interesting along the fence. When she pulled back, she was looking at him with something shining in her eyes that was not quite tears and not quite laughter, but was somehow both at once. "You impossible, honest, wonderful man," she said. "I thought perhaps," he said, "if you might be interested, I could stay on here for a while. Not as an appraiser." He managed a small smile. "I do know something about surveying, actual surveying. The kind that fills in blank places on maps instead of turning them into transaction reports. There's work enough in the territory for an honest surveyor." "You'd stay in Caldera Flats," she said slowly. "I'd stay wherever you are," he said, "if you want me to." She looked at him for a long moment, this woman who had built a home alone and kept it alone, and refused every offer to give up the thing she'd made. This woman who had sent away every person who had come to take something from her, and who had somehow decided that he was different, and who was now looking at him with the particular clear-eyed attention that meant she was seeing him fully and deciding something. "I want you to," she said. The weeks that followed were among the best of his life, though in a quiet way, the way the best things often are. He boarded at Mrs. Vargas's and rode out each morning, and they worked the ranch together in the practical and companionable way that suits 2 people who like each other and know their way around hard work. He fixed the roof of the barn in the 4th week, and she held the boards while he drove the nails, and they argued about the angle of the replacement beam in a way that was comfortable and affectionate and ended with her being right, which he told her without any difficulty. He corresponded with the Territorial Survey Office in Santa Fe, and they had work for him, honest survey work, the kind his father had done, charting land for homesteaders and setting accurate property boundaries in the basin and beyond, work that kept him in the territory and kept him useful, and allowed him to be at the Pritchard place most evenings for supper. Conception watched all of this with the permanent mild amusement that was her natural expression, and occasionally brought food under the pretense that Delia wasn't eating properly, which was less true every week. The company had, after much internal negotiation which was accelerated considerably by Martha Wiles's investigation, made a formal offer on the Pritchard land. The offer was for the southern 80 acres that formed the Mesa Rim, at a price calculated from Clarence's true appraisal, which came to $7,200 for that portion alone. The railroad would buy the grade access it needed and leave the rest of the property intact, including the spring, which was written into the easement documents with specific protections. Delia considered this offer for 1 week, consulting with Clarence and Hector and Conception and old Mr. Orozco, who had also been offered fair terms and was disposed to accept them. She wrote a counter-proposal that included additional protections for the water rights, a noise and smoke abatement clause for the proximity of the station works to her remaining buildings, and a provision that no additional acquisition of her land could be initiated for a period of 25 years without her explicit consent. The company, chastened by the investigation and aware that their negotiating position was not what it had been, accepted all of her terms. She signed the document at Hector's office on a Tuesday morning in September, with Clarence beside her and Conception present as a witness, and she signed it with the steady hand of a woman who has not given up anything she intended to keep. On the ride home afterward, with the September air cool and clear and the aspens along the creek beginning to turn yellow, He reached across and took her hand where it rested on the saddle horn, and she let him hold it all the way to the gate. He proposed to her on an October evening when the apple harvest was in, and the trees were bare, and the early dark came on quickly with a cold wind from the north. They were sitting on the porch with blankets around their shoulders and the first stars showing, and he had been thinking about how to say it for 3 weeks, going over various approaches with the meticulous care he brought to any survey, and in the end he said none of the prepared things and simply said, "Delia, I want to spend the rest of my life on this porch with you. Will you let me?" She had been looking at the evening star. She turned and looked at him with the expression that was her whole heart showing, the one she had been letting him see gradually for 4 months, the warmth behind all the practicality and the strength. "That is the most accurately worded proposal I have ever heard," she said. "Yes, of course, yes." He kissed her there on the porch with the cold wind coming and the coyotes calling and Bishop raising his head to look at them before deciding everything was fine and going back to sleep. And the evening star was very bright, and the night was enormous, and everything in it seemed to be arranged exactly as it should be. They married in the Caldera Flats Church on the second Saturday of December, 1882. With the crooked steeple above them and Father Domings presiding and half the town present, because Caldera Flats was not a large enough town for any significant event to go unattended. Conception cried openly and cheerfully. Hector Ruiz shook Clarence's hand with a grip that said more than the words that accompanied it. Old Mr. Orozco, who had accepted his own railroad offer, and was using the money to bring his sons back from Albuquerque, brought his fiddle and played in the churchyard afterward. Delia wore a dress of deep green wool, simply cut, with her hair pinned up and a small branch of dried apple blossom tucked into it, which she had dried in September against the probability of a December wedding, which he found, when she told him, to be entirely and perfectly characteristic of her. He moved into the house properly on the day they married, bringing his leather satchel, his brass compass, his few good books, and a new leather-bound ledger that would never be used for appraisals. He put the compass on the mantel next to the photograph of Thomas and the portrait of Delia's mother, and she looked at it there and said nothing, which meant she approved. The first winter of their marriage was cold and productive and close, the way winters are when you have spent enough time alone that another person's warmth in the house feels like a gift you're still getting used to. He worked on survey jobs that took him out into the basin 3 days a week and home the other 4. She ran the cattle and the garden and the apple trees with the assistance of a new hired hand named Tomas, 16 years old, who turned up at the gate one January morning with a letter of reference from Mr. Orozco and a willingness to work for modest wages and meals, which Delia provided, plus regular instruction in reading and arithmetic, because she was constitutionally incapable of watching anyone go uneducated. He learned the land the way she knew it, walking it with her through the winter and the spring that followed, learning where it was quiet and where it spoke, learning the particular sound the windmill made when the weather was changing, learning the way the light moved across the basin floor at different hours and seasons, learning which of the apple trees bore best in a dry year and which needed more water in the late summer. He drew a proper survey map of the property, the most accurate that had ever been made of it, and hung it in the kitchen, and she looked at it sometimes with an expression that was peaceful in a way that made his chest ache with gratitude. In the spring their first child was born, a boy they named Daniel, after Clarence's father and also after the river, because they both felt that naming a child after water in a dry country was a reasonable act of faith. He was a solid, serious infant who regarded the world with gray eyes inherited from his father and grew quickly in the way of children who are well-fed and much loved. Delia nursed him in the kitchen in the early mornings with the blue light coming through the window and Bishop on the floor nearby, and Clarence made coffee and watched them and felt something very simple and very complete that he had no adequate words for. The railroad station was completed on the southern portion of the property in the fall of 1883. A neat, functional operation with a water tower and a provisioning shed and a small platform where passengers changed horses and travelers stretched their legs before continuing west or east. It changed the character of the land to the south, as she had known it would, but the spring remained protected behind the easement language, and the Mesa Rim view was, if anything, more dramatic against the backdrop of steam and iron activity below it. She sold apples from Margaret and the other trees to the provisioning shed at the station, a small commercial arrangement that became a regular one, and she used the proceeds to fund the expansion of the kitchen garden and the acquisition of 2 more dairy cattle, and the ranch was more profitable in 1883 than it had been in any year since Thomas had started it. Gerald Ashby's business in the territory was considerably diminished by the investigation, which found sufficient evidence of fraud in his acquisition practices to result in several significant legal penalties, and the voiding of the acquisition contracts he had managed to complete before the freeze. He was not imprisoned, because the machinery of territorial law was imperfect and slow, but he lost enough that he retracted to his original holdings in the eastern part of the territory and was not heard from in the basin again. The Orozco family was intact and prospering. The Miller claims were taken up by a young couple from Texas who were, as far as anyone could tell, simply trying to run a decent ranch and had no complicated intentions about it. The federal land investigation had a longer tail, and Darby from the Santa Fe office spent some time in genuine legal jeopardy before resolving his situation through cooperation and substantial financial penalty. The Southwestern Land and Development Company, restructured after the scandal, sent a formal letter of apology to Clarence, which he used in a small private act of satisfaction to line the bottom of Bishop's water dish, and told Delia what he had done, and she laughed so hard she had to sit down. By the spring of 1884, Daniel was walking, or attempting to walk, with the determined lunging quality of a child who has decided that walking is necessary and is working on the details. He adored Bishop, and the baby adored him back in the way of good dogs who know when something small and new needs protecting. He was, from his earliest days, a child with his mother's quality of paying full attention and his father's quality of not speaking until he had something to say, which Conception said made him either a very wise child or a very strange one. And since Conception said this while feeding him corn mush and beaming, it was clear she felt favorably on either option. Delia was expecting their second child by the summer of 1884, which she announced to Clarence one evening in April when the apple trees were blossoming, and the kitchen garden was freshly turned, and the windmill was turning in a warm south breeze, by simply taking his hand and placing it on her abdomen and looking at him with that clear, direct look that contained her whole heart. He said, very softly, "Again." And she said, "Again." And Daniel, who was sitting on the kitchen floor with Bishop, looked up at both of them with his serious gray eyes as if he had understood everything and approved of it. Their second child was a boy as well, born in November of 1884 during the first hard freeze of the season, and they named him William after Delia's father, who had believed daughters deserved education and had been proven right. William was louder than Daniel from his first breath and more immediate in his demands and laughed earlier, and he had his mother's brown eyes and her particular quality of directness, and he and Daniel regarded each other from the beginning with the cautious mutual assessment of brothers who know they are going to be on the same side for the rest of their lives. The house changed around the growing family in the way that houses do when they are genuinely lived in, accumulating the comfortable evidence of years. The second floor that had been added to the original adobe structure by some previous owner was now properly a nursery and then a children's room, and Clarence built shelves in it for books and small collected objects, the same way his father had built shelves in the house on the Rio Grande. The kitchen expanded. The porch was reinforced, and a new section of railing added where the old one had gone soft. The barn was repainted, white with a red trim that Delia had selected from a mail-order catalog, and which Clarence had painted with the careful thoroughness he brought to all physical tasks. The survey work expanded into a business, modest but steady, and he hired 2 young men from town to assist with field work, and trained them with the rigor his father had trained him. One of them, a young Navajo man named Thomas Begay, who had grown up near the basin and knew the land in the deep instinctive way of people with long roots in a place, turned out to have a natural gift for survey work and eventually became Clarence's primary assistant. Their professional partnership built on a mutual respect that was also, over years, a genuine friendship. Tomas, the young hired hand, stayed on as he grew into a capable man, and by 1885 was running the cattle operation largely independently, which freed Delia to spend more time in the garden and the orchard, and increasingly, in the schooling of her own children and several children from neighboring homesteads who had no other access to formal education. This expanded gradually and informally until it was, by 1886, something that could fairly be called a school, held in the Pritchard kitchen 3 mornings a week, with Delia as the teacher and her library of Shakespeare and agricultural manuals as the primary resource, supplemented by a growing collection of new books acquired through the supply station and ordered from catalogs out of Santa Fe. Conception observed this development with her permanent amusement. "You are not going to be happy until you have educated everyone in the basin," she said one afternoon, sitting in the kitchen with coffee while 2 Orozco children practiced sums on slates at the table. "That's approximately correct," Delia agreed without looking up from the letter she was writing. "And your husband?" Delia looked up. "My husband is currently teaching Thomas Begay the finer points of theodolite calibration in the South pasture," she said. "He's also not going to be happy until he has charted every unmapped canyon in the territory. We accommodate each other." Conception laughed. "You are a good match," she said. "We really are," Delia agreed, with a simplicity and certainty that was not modest and was not boastful and was simply, as nearly everything she said was, the truth. On a Tuesday in October of 1886, the last Tuesday of the month when the weather was clear and the aspens along the creek were at their peak yellow, and the basin was wide and perfect in the autumn light, Clarence came home from a survey job to find Delia standing in the apple orchard with both boys. Daniel, now 4.5 and serious, William nearly 2, and already attempting to climb Margaret's lower branches. She was not doing anything in particular, just standing among the apple trees in the afternoon light, watching her children attempt to climb things, with Bishop sitting at her feet in his permanent posture of loyal attention. He pulled Sargent up at the gate and sat there for a moment, as he had on that first morning 2 years before, watching her without her knowing she was watched. He thought about the morning he had ridden down the rise with his leather satchel and his ledger and his carefully maintained professional distance, and the woman who had met him in the yard with an axe in her hand, and honest eyes, and 300 acres of hard-built life behind her. He thought about all the numbers he had not written down. He thought about his father's compass on the mantel. He thought about Daniel's gray eyes and William's brown ones, and the books on the shelves he had built, and the porch where they sat every evening that the weather permitted. He opened the gate and rode down to the house. She heard him and turned, and the boys turned with her, Daniel raising one hand in a greeting that was already almost a young man's gesture, and William letting go of Margaret's branch and making for him at a determined run that suggested he hadn't yet fully mastered direction, and Bishop barking once in greeting and once more for emphasis. He dismounted and caught William before the child could reach the horse's hooves, swinging him up to his hip, and the boy grabbed his coat collar with both fat fists and beamed at him with Delia's eyes. "Good survey?" she asked, walking toward him from among the trees. "Excellent survey," he said. "We found a spring on the Gallegos' claim that they didn't know about. It'll change the whole assessment of the property." "Another spring," she said, smiling. "This territory is full of hidden water," he said. "You just have to know how to look." He looked at her over William's head, this woman he had found in the middle of his professional life when he was 32 and going nowhere in particular, this woman who had made him want to stay. "How was your day?" "Good," she said simply. She stepped up close and kissed him, a brief, warm, everyday kiss, the kind that is more precious for being ordinary. "Come inside. Supper's nearly ready." He carried William up the porch steps, and Daniel came behind them at his careful, deliberate pace. And Bishop went ahead and pushed through the door with the authority of a dog who has been doing exactly this for years. And the house was warm with cooking smells, and the late afternoon light came golden through the kitchen window onto the survey map on the wall, and the books on the shelf, and the ledger on the desk. The new one that had never been used for appraisals. That was instead full of the ordered and detailed record of a life that had been built here, slowly and honestly, from nothing much but the willingness of two people to be true. He set William down and took off his coat and hung it on the hook by the door, and his brass compass sat on the mantel between the photograph of Thomas and the portrait of Delia's mother, and the apple trees were visible through the kitchen window going golden in the last of the October light. Every one of them named, every one of them tended, every one of them part of the particular and irreplaceable thing that this land had become under this woman's hands. He rolled up his sleeves and went to help with supper, and the kitchen filled with noise and warmth, and the ordinary good confusion of a family that has put down roots deep enough to hold in any weather. And outside the windmill turned in the evening breeze, and the mesas went red in the last of the sun, and the basin spread wide and patient all the way to the horizon, keeping its water and its secrets and its long memory of everyone who had ever stood on it and chosen to stay. The ledger on the desk was full of numbers, careful and exact and honestly arrived at, the record of 4 years of survey work across the basin and beyond, the blank places on the map being filled in one measurement at a time by a man who had found his way back to the work he had always meant to do, and to the place he had always, without quite knowing it, been looking for. He had come to appraise her land. He had left without writing a single number down. And then he had come back, and written down every true number there was, and found that the most important measure of anything was not its market value, but its meaning to the person who had built their life upon it. Delia put a bowl on the table and called the boys to wash their hands and looked across the kitchen at her husband, with a look that needed no words and had needed none for some time. And the evening came on clear and cold over the mesa, and everything was, and everything remained, exactly what it had always been meant to be.